In the winter of 1943, 6 men strapped on skis and disappeared into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They were heading toward a heavily guarded Nazi facility sitting on the edge of a cliff in the mountains of Norway. Inside that facility was something that could change the outcome of the entire war. Not weapons, not soldiers, not gold, heavy water. The key ingredient Hitler needed to build an atomic bomb. If the Nazis succeeded, if they built that bomb before the Americans, the war would end very differently. These 6 men were the only thing standing between Hitler and a nuclear weapon. And almost nobody knew they existed. To understand why this mission mattered, you need to understand what heavy water is. Heavy water looks identical to normal water. You could pour it into a glass and never know the difference. But chemically, it is not the same. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, can be used as a moderator in a nuclear reactor. It slows down neutrons in a way that allows a chain reaction to be sustained. In 1943, Nazi Germany was actively pursuing an atomic bomb program, and the only facility in the world capable of producing heavy water in large quantities was sitting in the mountains of Telemark, Norway. It was called Vemork. The Germans had occupied Norway in 1940 and immediately recognized what Vemork represented. They ramped up heavy water production to maximum capacity. Every liter produced brought Hitler one step closer to a nuclear weapon. The Allies knew this, and they knew they had to stop it. The first attempt to destroy Vemork was a disaster. In November 1942, the British sent 2 gliders carrying 34 soldiers toward Norway. Both gliders crashed in the mountains. The survivors were captured by the Gestapo. They were executed. The mission had failed before it even began. But 4 men were already in Norway waiting for those soldiers. They were Norwegian special operatives who had been trained in Britain and parachuted into the mountains weeks earlier. Their code name was Grouse. After the gliders crashed, they were alone. In the Norwegian mountains, in winter, with no support, no resupply, no communication for weeks. They survived by hunting reindeer and melting snow for water. They waited, because they knew the Allies would try again. In February 1943, 6 more men parachuted into Norway. Their mission was called Operation Gunnerside. These 6 men, all Norwegian, had been trained specifically for this mission. They knew the facility. They knew the terrain. Several of them had grown up in those mountains. They linked up with the 4 surviving members of the Grouse team. Now there were 10 men. 10 men to destroy the most important industrial target in Nazi-occupied Europe. Vemork was considered impregnable. It sat on a narrow plateau above a deep gorge. The only bridge across the gorge was heavily guarded by German soldiers. The Germans had dismissed the idea of an attack through the gorge itself. The terrain was considered impossible. The walls were nearly vertical. The river at the bottom was freezing and fast, which is exactly why the team chose that route. On the night of February 27, 1943, the 10 men descended into the gorge in complete darkness. The temperature was far below zero. They crossed the frozen river at the bottom and began climbing the other side. Straight up, in the dark, in the cold, with explosives strapped to their backs. When they reached the top, they cut through a fence and found an entrance cable shaft that one of the team members had used years earlier when he worked at the facility. They crawled inside. The plan was precise. They needed to reach the basement where the heavy water cells were stored. A small team, just 2 men, would enter the basement and place the explosives. The others would provide cover. They moved through the facility silently. A Norwegian guard was inside the basement. Instead of killing him, one of the operatives spoke to him quietly in Norwegian, told him what was happening, told him to stay down. The guard cooperated. The explosives were placed directly on the heavy water cells. The fuses were lit. The team moved out. 30 seconds later, the charges detonated. The explosion was smaller than expected, deliberately. A massive explosion would have triggered an immediate German response across the entire region. The team needed time to escape. But the damage was catastrophic for the German nuclear program. Months of heavy water production, destroyed in 30 seconds. The cells were obliterated. The heavy water flooded the basement floor and drained away. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Over 3,000 German soldiers were deployed across the Telemark region to find the saboteurs. The 10 men split up and disappeared into the mountains. Several of them skied over 400 kilometers to neutral Sweden to escape. Others stayed in Norway and continued working with the resistance. Not one of them was captured. But the story doesn't end there. The Germans began rebuilding. By the end of 1943, they had partially restored production at Vemork, and they made a decision. They were going to move the remaining heavy water stock out of Norway, by ferry, across Lake Tinsjø to Germany. The Allies found out, and they made a brutal decision. The ferry had to be sunk, but the ferry carried civilian passengers, Norwegian civilians, innocent people. The decision was made anyway. A Norwegian operative planted explosives on the ferry. On February 20th, 1944, the SF Hydro sank in the deepest part of Lake Tinsjø. 18 Norwegian civilians died, along with the last significant stockpile of heavy water in German hands. The Nazi atomic bomb program never recovered. When American scientists tested a nuclear device in July 1945 at Trinity, and when bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki weeks later, the world finally understood what an atomic weapon could do. Germany never got there, partly because of strategic failures, partly because their best scientists had fled the regime, but partly, significantly, because 10 men climbed down a frozen gorge in the middle of the night and placed explosives on a set of metal cylinders in a Norwegian basement. The men of Operation Gunnerside returned to Norway after the war. Some became engineers. Some became teachers. Some lived quietly in the same mountains where they had hidden from 3,000 German soldiers. Joachim Rønneberg, the mission commander, lived until 2018. He was 99 years old. In interviews late in his life, he was always asked the same question: "Did you know what you were doing would matter that much?" He always gave the same answer: "We knew the heavy water mattered. We didn't think about the rest. We just did what needed to be done." 10 men, one night, a frozen gorge, 30 seconds of explosives, and Hitler never got his bomb. If you want more stories like this, the ones that actually changed the course of history, subscribe, because there are files that were never meant to be opened.